The Universal Species Classification Index was, according to its creators, the pinnacle of scientific objectivity, a masterwork of data analysis that ranked every sentient species in the galaxy based on their technological advancement, biological capabilities, psychic potential, and overall contribution to galactic civilization. What it actually was, of course, was the universe's most elaborate way of telling 90% of all species that they were disappointments. At the very top of this cosmic report card sat the crystalline hegemony, beings of pure energy who had transcended physical form approximately 3 million years ago, and now spent their time contemplating the fundamental nature of reality, while occasionally pausing to remind everyone else how primitive they were. They rated a perfect category Alpha Prime, which was essentially the galactic equivalent of being the teacher's pet. If the teacher controlled 17% of known space, and could incinerate solar systems with a particularly focused thought. Just below them lurked the Void Hunters, a charming collection of spacefaring predators who had evolved natural faster-than-light capabilities and could survive in hard vacuum for centuries at a time. They spent their leisure hours hunting stellar leviathans for sport and considered supernovas to be adequate mood lighting. Category Alpha Secondary, because even the classification system had standards about rewarding species whose idea of diplomacy involved eating the other party's homework. The techno-symbionts occupied the third tier, having achieved perfect harmony between organic intelligence and artificial processing power. Each individual was simultaneously a person and a computer network, capable of calculating hyperspace trajectories while composing poetry about the mathematical beauty of entropy. They had solved faster-than-light communication 3 millennia ago, and used it primarily to share increasingly elaborate memes across galactic distances. Category Alpha Tertiary, because the universe appreciated efficiency, even when it came with a disturbing tendency to speak in binary during intimate moments. And so the list continued, a carefully catalogued parade of species who could manipulate matter with their minds, survive in the cores of stars, or achieve technological singularities before they discovered agriculture. Each entry meticulously documented their achievements, capabilities, and contributions to the greater galactic community. Their crystalline carapace shifted through various shades of bureaucratic beige as they scrolled through the endless digital forms, each one representing another species that had somehow managed to achieve sentience, despite what appeared to be the universe's active efforts to prevent. The middle tiers were filled with the usual suspects: energy manipulators, reality benders, species that could photosynthesize starlight, and the inevitable collection of hive minds that insisted on referring to themselves in the plural even when ordering coffee. Each had their particular specialization, their unique contribution to the galactic ecosystem of commerce, culture, and controlled violence. But as Hexus scrolled toward the bottom of the list, the entries became increasingly tragic. Species that had discovered fire but not the wheel. Civilizations that had achieved spaceflight but still couldn't figure out how to make their governments function for more than a decade at a time. The sort of cosmic underachievers who made the universe wonder if perhaps intelligence was just a statistical anomaly that would eventually correct itself. And then, at the very bottom, below even the gastropod confederation, who at least had the excuse of being actual snails, sat humanity. Category Omega 7, Cosmically Irrelevant. Hexus paused at the entry, mandibles clicking in what passed for a sigh among their species. The human file was extensive, but not in any way that suggested competence. Native to a small, unremarkable world in an equally unremarkable star system, humans had managed to achieve basic spaceflight through what appeared to be a combination of controlled explosions and sheer bloody-mindedness. Their technological advancement could charitably be described as adequate. Their psychic abilities were completely non-existent, and their contribution to galactic civilization consisted primarily of asking awkward questions during diplomatic functions, and occasionally starting wars over ideological differences that other species couldn't even properly comprehend. The biological assessment was equally unimpressive. Humans were fragile, short-lived creatures who required a precisely calibrated atmospheric mixture to survive, couldn't see beyond a narrow spectrum of visible light, and died if they went more than a few days without consuming water. They had no natural armor, no energy projection capabilities, no ability to survive in vacuum, and their idea of genetic modification involved arguing about it for decades before doing anything useful. Their psychological profile was perhaps the most damning section of all. Humans displayed an alarming tendency toward what the Classification Bureau had carefully termed irrational persistence in the face of insurmountable odds. They refused to acknowledge when situations were hopeless, frequently attempted to solve problems that more advanced species had given up on centuries ago, and showed a disturbing inclination to treat potentially species-ending scenarios as interesting challenges. The file included 17 separate incident reports of humans encountering situations that should have resulted in immediate extinction, only to somehow emerge with new technologies, cultural developments, or in one particularly baffling case, a thriving trade relationship with the hostile force that had been trying to eliminate them. Hexis made a note to have the psychological assessment team review their method. Clearly there were some flaws in their analysis, because no species could be that consistently lucky, while simultaneously being that consistently stupid. The economic section was equally bewildering. Despite having one of the smallest territorial holdings in known space, humans had somehow managed to establish trade relationships with species who were supposedly several technological tiers above them. They exported cultural products, scientific research, and something called consultation services that involved sending human advisors to help other civilizations solve problems. The fact that these consultations were apparently successful only added to the overall confusion surrounding humanity's classification, but the numbers didn't lie, and the Universal Species Classification Index was built on number. Humans scored consistently in the bottom percentiles across every major category. Their technological achievements were laughably primitive compared to the galactic standard, and their biological limitations should have prevented them from achieving anything more significant than basic agriculture, which made it all the more puzzling that they kept showing up in incident reports throughout the galaxy, usually in contexts that suggested they had somehow managed to accomplish things that should have been completely impossible for a species of their demonstrated capability. Hexis closed the file with another clicking sigh. Perhaps it was time to consider updating the classification criteria. After all, the index was supposed to be a living document, capable of adapting to new data and changing circumstances. But then again, that would require admitting that the most sophisticated analytical framework in galactic history might have overlooked something important about the species currently ranked as the cosmic equivalent of an administrative error. And that, Hexis reflected while updating humanity's status to under review, would be almost as embarrassing as the alternative explanation that the universe's most elaborate classification system had been completely, catastrophically wrong about the small, fragile, impossibly stubborn species that refused to stay in their assigned category. The administrator made one final note in the file, a small addendum that would prove prophetic in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Recommend continued observation. Human behavior patterns suggest possible classification anomaly. It was, as understatements went, roughly equivalent to describing a supernova as somewhat bright. 3 standard galactic months after Administrator Hexis filed their classification anomaly report, it landed on the desk of Professor Yulthan, a mid-tier research specialist in the Crystalline Hegemony's Department of Inferior Species Studies. Yulthan had been studying lesser civilizations for approximately 4,000 years, which in hegemony terms made them barely qualified to organize a filing cabinet, but in the broader galactic context, made them one of the foremost experts on why most species were doomed to perpetual mediocrity. The professor's current project involved cataloging the various ways primitive species managed to eliminate themselves before achieving meaningful technological advancement. It was fascinating work in the same way that watching a train wreck was fascinating, horrible, but difficult to look away from. The research had practical applications too. Understanding failure patterns helped the hegemony predict which species were worth establishing trade relations with and which ones would probably blow themselves up before the paperwork was finalized. Humanity's file represented something of a puzzle in this context. By all rights, they should have eliminated themselves centuries ago. Their homeworld was a barely habitable rock orbiting a temperamental star. They had developed nuclear weapons before developing basic space travel, and their political systems appeared to be based on the revolutionary concept that disagreement should be resolved through elaborate public arguments, followed by the selection of leaders via popularity contest. Yet here they were, still stubbornly existing, and apparently expanding their territory despite having no business surviving their own incompetence. Yulthun decided that humanity represented a perfect opportunity for what they liked to call practical xenosociology research, but what was more accurately described as poking primitive species with increasingly large sticks to see what happened. The hegemony had a long and distinguished tradition of such experiments, justified by the impeccable logic that understanding how inferior species responded to controlled adversity provided valuable data for the advancement of galactic civilization. The fact that these experiments also provided entertainment for bored energy beings, who had transcended most forms of physical amusement, was of course purely coincidental. The first test was elegantly simple. Yulthun selected Kepler 4442c, a world that had killed 3 separate colonization attempts by species considerably more advanced than humanity. The planet featured atmospheric storms that could strip flesh from bone, soil so contaminated with heavy metals that even radiation-resistant bacteria died within hours, and a native ecosystem that consisted primarily of carnivorous plants with a taste for anything containing carbon. The hegemony's Xenobiological Assessment Team had rated Kepler 44442c as having a 97% fatality rate for standard galactic colonization attempts. Most species took one look at the environmental data and decided that perhaps they didn't need more living space after all. Humanity's response was to pack 17,000 volunteers into converted cargo ships and announce that they were going to give it a try. Yulthun monitored the experiment with the detached interest of a scientist observing bacteria in a petri dish. The initial results were predictably catastrophic. Within the first standard week, over 300 humans had died from various combinations of atmospheric poisoning, predation, and what appeared to be simple bad luck. The survivors responded by building underground shelters, developing filtration systems from salvaged ship parts, and beginning what they cheerfully referred to as aggressive agricultural experimentation. By the end of the first month, human fatality rates had dropped to manageable level. By the end of the third month, they had established sustainable food production. By the end of the first year, they had begun modifying the local ecosystem to better suit their needs, using techniques that involved controlled breeding of the carnivorous plants to create defensive perimeters around their settlement. Within 5 years, Kepler 44442c was exporting food to other human colonies. Within a decade, it had become a garden world, whose atmospheric composition had been improved to the point where other species were requesting permission to establish research stations there. Yulthun stared at the data streams with what would have been slack-jawed amazement if they had possessed a jaw. This was not how inferior species were supposed to behave. The proper response to insurmountable odds was extinction, not agricultural innovation. Clearly, the first test had been too easy. The second experiment involved a more sophisticated challenge. The hegemony had been monitoring the spread of something called the dissolution plague, a bioweapon that had been developed by an unknown species approximately 2,000 years ago, and had subsequently escaped containment. The plague was a masterwork of malicious genetic engineering, capable of adapting to any biological system it encountered and reducing complex organisms to their component molecules within hours of infection. 3 separate galactic civilizations had been completely eliminated by the plague. The remaining species had quarantined 17 star systems where outbreaks had occurred, and established a strict policy of immediate planetary sterilization if any signs of infection were detected. Yulthun arranged for a navigation error that resulted in a human exploration vessel being exposed to a mild strain of the plague. The ship's crew of 47 individuals should have been reduced to organic soup within 6 hours. Instead, they spent the next 3 days running detailed biological analyses of the plague samples, apparently under the assumption that they could figure out how to cure themselves before they died. This was, from a scientific standpoint, a reasonable approach. The fact that it actually worked was considerably more puzzling. Not only did the human medical team develop an immunity treatment, they managed to reverse engineer the plague's adaptive mechanisms and create a vaccine that was effective against all known variants. Then, because apparently surviving an encounter with a galaxy-ending bioweapon wasn't sufficient excitement for 1 week, they used their research to develop medical treatments for 17 different degenerative diseases that had been plaguing various species for millennia.
The humans then distributed these treatments freely throughout the galaxy, along with detailed research notes and a cheerful message, explaining that they hoped their little medical adventure might be useful to other civilizations. Yulthun's research notes from this period consisted primarily of variations on "this should not be possible," and check calculations again. The professor began to suspect that either their understanding of basic causality was fundamentally flawed, or humanity represented some sort of statistical anomaly that broke conventional models of species development. The third test was designed to eliminate any possibility of luck or coincidence. Yulthun selected the most straightforward challenge available: pure, unadulterated survival against overwhelming odds. The entropy swarm was a collection of self-replicating nanobots that had been drifting through space for approximately 50,000 years, consuming matter and energy from anything they encountered. The swarm had devoured entire star systems, turning thriving civilizations into clouds of undifferentiated particles. Even the crystalline hegemony considered the swarm to be too dangerous for direct engagement, preferring to monitor its movements and evacuate any systems that appeared to be in its path. Humanity's first recorded encounter with the swarm should have resulted in the immediate and total dissolution of their exploration fleet. Instead, Captain Delwyn Hayes of the human vessel, probably fine, sent a message back to Earth that read, in its entirety, "Found something interesting. Sending samples. Please advise on best containment procedures for universe-eating robots." The human response to encountering an existential threat to all known life was apparently to study it more carefully. What followed was 6 months of the most intensive scientific research in recorded galactic history, conducted by humans who seemed to operate under the assumption that any problem could be solved if you applied sufficient amounts of curiosity, stubbornness, and controlled explosion. The breakthrough came when Dr. Evangeline Cross discovered that the nanobots were still following their original programming, which had been designed to optimize resource consumption rather than destruction. The swarm wasn't malicious, it was just very, very good at its job. The human solution was elegantly simple. They reprogrammed the swarm. Instead of consuming matter indiscriminately, the nanobots were given new instructions to construct useful infrastructure. Within a year, the entropy swarm had become the galaxy's most efficient construction fleet, capable of building Dyson spheres, terraforming planets, and creating transportation networks that spanned star systems. Humanity offered to share the reprogramming techniques with any interested civilizations, along with detailed safety protocols and a user manual that began with the phrase, "Congratulations on your new universe-improving robot friend." Yulthun's final research report consisted of a single sentence repeated 473 times. "This does not compute." The professor submitted a formal request to the Hegemony High Council, recommending immediate revision of humanity's classification status, and suggesting that perhaps the Universal Species Classification Index needed some fundamental adjustments to its underlying assumption. The response was swift and unambiguous. Professor Yulthun was reassigned to a position studying the mating habits of crystalline moss in the Outer Rim territories, and humanity's classification remained unchanged. After all, the index was the pinnacle of scientific objectivity. If the humans were really as remarkable as the evidence suggested, surely the numbers would reflect that. The fact that the numbers might be measuring the wrong things entirely was a possibility that the hegemony was not quite ready to consider.
Word of humanity's latest achievement spread through the galaxy with the kind of velocity typically reserved for bad news and tax audits. The transformation of the entropy swarm from universe-ending catastrophe to cosmic construction crew had not gone unnoticed by the various intelligence agencies, military organizations, and bureaucratic oversight committees that kept the galactic community functioning in its usual state of barely controlled chaos. The Void Hunters, who prided themselves on being apex predators, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that their carefully maintained hunting grounds now contained a species that apparently considered galaxy-threatening disasters to be interesting engineering challenges. The techno-symbionts, masters of optimization and efficiency, discovered that their most sophisticated algorithms couldn't predict or replicate human problem-solving methodologies, which seemed to involve equal parts scientific analysis and what they could only describe as weaponized optimism. Even the crystalline hegemony was beginning to experience something that might charitably be called concern though they expressed it through increasingly passive-aggressive energy fluctuations during diplomatic function. But it was the Galactic Preservation Institute that took the most direct action. As the galaxy's self-appointed guardians against existential threats, they had been monitoring humanity with growing alarm ever since the nanobots incident. Their latest intelligence briefings included phrases like containment protocols recommended and potential threat to established order, which in diplomatic terms translated roughly to "these people are making us nervous." The Institute's Director of Strategic Threats, a being whose species had evolved from mathematical equations and communicated primarily through statistical analysis, decided that humanity required more comprehensive evaluation. If these creatures were somehow circumventing the fundamental laws of probability and causality, it was essential to understand how before they accidentally destabilized something important. The test they devised was, in their estimation, the perfect challenge, absolutely unquestionably, mathematically impossible to survive, let alone solve. The Fibonacci cascade was a naturally occurring phenomenon that appeared in star systems where the fundamental constants of physics had become unstable. Reality itself began to unravel in predictable mathematical patterns, with matter and energy following increasingly complex sequences until the affected region collapsed into what theorists called a conceptual vacuum, a space where the basic ideas underlying existence simply ceased to function. The phenomenon had appeared 17 times in recorded galactic history. Each time, the affected system and everything in it had been completely erased from reality, leaving behind regions of space that hurt to think about too hard. The standard response protocol was simple: evacuate everything within 50 light-years, and pretend the area didn't exist. When the cascade began forming in the Proxima Centauri system, the Institute saw an opportunity. They quietly arranged for a human research expedition to discover the phenomenon, expecting to observe how an inferior species reacted to absolute inevitable extinction. The human response was, by now, depressingly predictable. Amelia Foster, expedition leader and apparently someone who had never encountered a cosmic horror she didn't want to poke with a stick, submitted her initial report with barely contained enthusiasm. "We've discovered what appears to be a fundamental breakdown in the structure of reality itself. Request immediate deployment of additional research personnel and equipment." This is the most exciting thing that's happened all year. The Institute's monitoring stations recorded the next 6 months with the kind of horrified fascination typically reserved for natural disasters and reality television. Instead of fleeing from the expanding zone of mathematical impossibility, the humans established research stations at the phenomenon's edge, and began conducting what they cheerfully called experimental ontology. Their approach was characteristically direct. If reality was breaking down according to mathematical principles, then perhaps it could be fixed using better mathematics. The human research team included physicists, mathematicians, philosophers, and for reasons that baffled outside observers, a significant number of individuals whose primary qualification appeared to be an unshakable belief that any problem could be solved if you approached it with sufficient creativity and stubbornness. They worked in shifts around the clock, developing increasingly sophisticated models of how existence functioned and testing their theories by literally experimenting with the fundamental nature of reality. Foster's progress reports read like a combination of advanced scientific research and a particularly optimistic suicide note. Day 47. Successfully stabilized a cubic kilometer of causality using modified quantum field equations. Team morale remains high. Note: reality appears to respond well to positive reinforcement. By the 3rd month, the humans had not only halted the cascade's expansion, but had begun actively reversing the damage. They developed techniques for reality reinforcement that involved injecting stable mathematical constants back into the affected regions, essentially teaching existence how to exist properly again. By the 6th month, the Proxima Centauri system was not only fully restored, but had become more stable than it had been before the cascade began. The humans had accidentally improved the fundamental structure of spacetime in the entire region, creating what they modestly described as optimized local physics. The Institute's final report on the incident consisted largely of statistical analyses that kept producing results like probability of success, mathematically undefined, and threat assessment, exceeds classification parameters. The directors submitted a formal recommendation that humanity be immediately reclassified as a strategic asset, and placed under protective supervision, primarily to prevent them from accidentally solving any more universal constants. But the ripple effects had already begun. Word spread through the galactic community that the humans had not merely survived another impossible challenge, but had somehow made the universe itself work better in the process. Species that had spent millennia accepting certain limitations as immutable laws of nature began quietly requesting consultation services from human experts. The crystalline hegemony found themselves in the unprecedented position of seeking advice from beings they had previously considered barely above the level of cosmic background radiation. Their energy-based physiology had always prevented them from directly interacting with matter-based technology, a limitation they had accepted as the natural price of transcendence. Human engineers took one look at the problem and suggested a solution involving quantum interface buffers that allowed energy beings to manipulate physical objects without losing their incorporeal nature. The Void Hunters, who had spent millennia perfecting their hunting techniques, discovered that human tactical analysts could identify weaknesses in their prey that had gone unnoticed for thousands of years. More disturbing still, the humans seemed genuinely excited about helping optimize predation strategies, approaching the challenge with the same enthusiasm they brought to every other seemingly impossible problem. Even the techno-symbionts found their perfect efficiency improved by human suggestions for creative inefficiency protocols that introduced controlled randomness into their systems, allowing for innovative solutions that pure logic couldn't achieve. Administrator Hexus watched these developments with the growing suspicion that their carefully maintained classification system was about to undergo some very uncomfortable revision. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Humanity had somehow become the galaxy's unofficial department of impossible problems, consulted by species whose technological and biological superiority was supposedly beyond question. The most disturbing aspect wasn't that humans kept succeeding where others failed. It was that they seemed to genuinely believe that every challenge was solvable, every problem had an answer, and every impossibility was just a puzzle that hadn't been properly understood yet. It was the kind of attitude that more advanced species had learned to abandon millennia ago, recognizing it as the naive optimism of youth that matured civilizations outgrew in favor of realistic acceptance of limitation. Except that humanity's naive optimism kept producing results that mature realistic civilizations couldn't achieve. The galaxy was slowly coming to terms with an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps the most sophisticated species weren't always the most effective ones. Perhaps there was something to be said for the kind of bloody-minded persistence that refused to acknowledge when problems were unsolvable. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Universal Species Classification Index had been measuring entirely the wrong things all along. The emergency session of the Galactic Classification Council was called after humanity's latest achievement reached the highest levels of bureaucratic panic. Amelia Foster and her team hadn't just prevented the heat death of the universe, they had done so while filing a routine research report that concluded with "Thanks for the opportunity to study this fascinating cosmological event. Please let us know if you have any other interesting projects." The universe's gradual expansion toward thermodynamic equilibrium had been accepted by every major civilization as the ultimate, unavoidable endpoint of existence. It was a problem so fundamentally unsolvable that most species had built their entire philosophies around accepting it. The crystalline hegemony had spent millions of years preparing for transcendence beyond physical reality. The Void Hunters had developed elaborate cultural rituals celebrating the eventual silence of all things. The techno-symbionts had calculated precisely when their final backup servers would succumb to entropy. Humanity's response had been to look at the universe's energy budget and suggest some minor efficiency improvement. Administrator Hexus stood before the assembled council with what passed for a migraine among their species. The evidence was undeniable. Humanity had successfully implemented a universe-wide energy recycling system that would extend the lifespan of reality by approximately 14 trillion years. They had accomplished this using modified quantum field generators, and what their technical documentation referred to as aggressive thermodynamic optimization. The report included helpful diagrams and a troubleshooting section. Council Speaker Valdris, representing the oldest and presumably wisest civilization in the galaxy, initiated the formal proceedings with barely concealed desperation. "We are here to address classification anomaly 707042,
Omega. The species designated as human continues to produce results that are incompatible with their assigned category. This emergency session will determine appropriate reclassification measures. The testimony that followed painted a picture of galactic cognitive dissonance on a scale that defied rational analysis. Representative after representative stood to describe how their supposedly superior civilizations had been quietly relying on human consultation to solve problems they couldn't handle themselves. The entropy engineers admitted that humanity's nanobots were now handling 90% of their construction projects, because human-programmed systems worked faster and more efficiently than anything their civilization had developed in 20,000 years of technological refinement. The quantum philosophers confessed that human metaphysicians had resolved several paradoxes that had stumped their greatest thinkers for millennia, apparently by approaching abstract concepts with the same practical problem-solving methods they used for fixing broken spaceship engines. The Psi-Corps reluctantly acknowledged that humans, despite having no measurable psychic abilities, had somehow developed mental training techniques that improved telepathic performance in other species by an average of 47%. The pattern was everywhere, once you knew how to look for it. Every major galactic civilization had at some point in the last decade quietly contracted human advisors to help with challenges that their own experts had deemed impossible. The species ranked lowest in the galaxy had somehow become indispensable to everyone ranked above them. Council Speaker Valdris called for testimony from the original classification assessment teams, hoping to understand where the system had gone wrong. What they discovered was worse than a simple miscalculation. The Universal Species Classification Index was working exactly as designed. Humanity scored low on technological sophistication because their technology was primitive and improvised. They scored low on biological capabilities because they were fragile and limited. They scored low on psychic potential because they had none. They scored low on territorial holdings because their space was small and unremarkable. Every single measurement was accurate. The problem was that the measurements were measuring the wrong things. Dr. Yenth of the Classification Development Committee delivered the final devastating analysis. Our system measures what species have accomplished. It does not measure what they are capable of accomplishing. We have been rating civilizations based on their achievements, not their potential for achievement. The revelation hit the Council like a particularly well-aimed asteroid. Every advanced species in the galaxy had optimized themselves for their current capability. They had achieved remarkable heights of technological sophistication, biological adaptation, and psychic development, but in doing so had created systems and mindsets that were perfectly suited to the challenges they had already solved. Humanity, in their primitive inefficiency, had maintained something that more advanced species had optimized away: adaptability. They approached new problems without preconceptions about what was possible, because they hadn't yet learned what was impossible. The crystalline hegemony had transcended physical limitations, but had lost the ability to think in physical terms. The Void Hunters had perfected predation but couldn't conceive of cooperation. The techno-symbionts had achieved optimal efficiency, but had eliminated the creative chaos that produced innovative solutions. Humanity's weakness was that they hadn't figured out their limitations yet, and apparently this was the greatest strength in the galaxy. The final classification debate lasted for 17 hours, and resulted in the creation of an entirely new category, paradoxically essential. The official definition read, species whose apparent limitations enable capabilities that exceed their measurable parameters through mechanisms not yet understood by galactic science. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of admitting that the universe had a sense of humor, and they weren't in on the joke. Administrator Hexus filed the updated classification, with the weary satisfaction of someone who had spent their career measuring the wrong things, and had finally been proven comprehensively wrong by the right people. Humanity's new status came with a formal recommendation that other species consult human advisors before attempting any project classified as impossible, along with a standing request that humans please notify the relevant authorities before accidentally solving any more fundamental laws of physics. The humans, when informed of their reclassification, responded with typical grace and humility. "Thanks. This is really exciting." We've been working on some ideas for improving faster-than-light communication that we think you'll find interesting. Also, has anyone tried turning the galaxy off and on again? We've noticed some inefficiencies in the galactic rotation that might be affecting overall performance. And so the galaxy's weakest species became its most essential resource, not through strength or wisdom or technological superiority, but through the simple stubborn refusal to accept that problems couldn't be solved. It was, as Administrator Hexis noted in their final report, the most expensive lesson in humility that galactic civilization had ever received. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting 14 billion years to deliver the punchline,